Creating the backgrounds for our glass technique is a fairly simple process, but everything in digital photography is simple once you've done it a number of times. So let's just quickly go through some of the ideas we might want to use. I'm going to create a new canvas. I'm working in Photoshop, but I could easily be in Photoshop Elements. So to create a new canvas, let's go to File, New. The size of the canvas, 1920 pixels by 1080. Lots of ways to measure a new canvas, but pixels is going to suit our needs here. Doesn't matter what color the background contents are, we can click OK. There we have our start. If we go to the toolbar on the left hand side, the tool I'm going to start with is the gradient tool. If I click and hold, you'll see there's a number of different tools there, but the one I want is the gradient tool. We have a number of options for this tool at the top of the screen, and we can investigate different types of gradients here. But let's start with what's called the linear gradient, which is the one on the far left. But here is where we need to choose some of our colors, because we want to keep this quick and simple. If I drop down this panel, you can see some of those colors appear. Let me pick a really bright, vivid band of color here, and the way we apply it on the image is simply to draw a line. How long we draw that line will determine the gradation between the colors. Let me quickly demonstrate that by drawing a very short line, and then you can see the sort of effect we have. Now if I draw a line from the top to the bottom, you'll see the difference we get in the gradient we've created. So you can see that in a few moments we could create quite a number of different gradients, because we can go corner to corner, we can go side to side, we can go a short distance, or we can go a long distance. Generally speaking, if we were going to choose between vertical bands here or horizontal, I think the horizontal are probably going to be better to start with. So there's our first colored background. All I would need to do with this particular image is to save it into perhaps a dedicated folder for my backgrounds, saving it as a JPEG image. But it makes sense that if we're going to create a gradient like this, that we create 2 or 3 different variants. I've already demonstrated 1 or 2 where we can draw the gradient line longer or shorter. But the obvious example is drawing the gradient from the extreme top to the bottom gives us what we're looking at here. But of course it would make sense probably to do the same thing the other way and save that as a variation. Now there's quite a number of choices in this drop down panel that we looked at a few moments ago. So let's go back to the first of the coloured ones. It's coloured red and green, so we've got the same options that we had before, but let's just keep things simple for the moment and we'll draw our lines from the top to the bottom. So there's another gradient, bottom to the top, there's the variant. Now we can go through all of these and make quite a series of different colours. You can see all the different colours and the bands here. You can investigate making others if you wish. I never found I really needed to get that deep into making these backgrounds. But one thing you can do, you can go down to your colour palette down here. So if you wanted 2 particular colours, if you wanted to choose a deep blue and a pale blue, we can do that. When we select the gradient tool, from the option here we can now select this, which reflects the 2 colors I've just selected, and once again I can create gradients in exactly the same way as before. And if I want the gradient tighter between the 2 colors, then I make a shorter line. An option we have with smooth gradient color like this is to add a degree of noise. So if we go to our filters menu and choose noise, add noise, All I'm going to select here is Gaussian, monochromatic noise, somewhere around about 5%. You'll find that will work pretty well too. Here's another option to create a background. I've just opened up a picture. This is a straight shot of a piece of rock on the beach. I've already put quite a bit of contrast and colour into it, but let's take a look at what we can do here. Maybe the first thing I would do is to go to my crop tool, and I would crop this to a more reasonable size because I don't need to work with huge images. So I may just make this one 1920 pixels by 1080, and I can put those values into my crop tool and then apply it. I'll hit Control 0 because with something like this we may want to enhance the colour even more. Well, we have options within Photoshop to do that quickly and easily. Let's go to Image, Adjustment, Hue and Saturation. So here we could boost the saturation because we're looking for quite bright colour here. So we could save this and use it just as it is. We could then save a derivative using Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and we can blur this. Well, we could blur it in a number of different ways. We could make 3 or 4 different variations. They're all going to give you a different effect. Or maybe we could try one of the other blur options. So with this image, let's go to Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. There's a couple of options here, Zoom and Spin. Let's take Spin first, and we get the option to increase or decrease the spin. So we've got a limit from 0 or 1 to 100. So let's take a midway point of around about 50. Do we want good quality, draft or best? To be honest, I don't think it matters hardly any at all. So let's just take the draft and click OK. There you can see we have quite an interesting background image to use with our glass. Now, if you was looking at applying this sort of filter effect to a number of different images, one of the things you need to bear in mind is every time you apply a filter in Photoshop, it will remember that and leave it at the top of the filter stack. So if I wanted to open up further images to apply the radial blur, I can just hit Control F or select it from here. In this instance though, I'm going to hit Control Z to undo that, go back to my filter, blur, back into the radial blur again, and we'll choose the zoom option. Same thing, let's give this a little more and click OK. A different effect entirely. One of the blur options that did seem to work better than most was the vertical blur. So once again, if I hit Control Z, I'll go back to my filter, back into the blur once again. This time we're going to use motion blur. You can see we can choose the direction, but what we want is something like that, 90 or minus 90. Then we can move the blur up considerably until we get just streaks of colour. And there we have more options to use with our glass. So you can see it's not going to take very long before we've got 20 or 30 backgrounds to start the process. Now here, as you can see, I've just got a simple cloudscape. It's a little bit weak on colour, so we may want to push the colour up, but if you do have filters on your computer such as Topaz Impression, I'm going to use Topaz Impression 2, and what we can do here is perhaps use something along the lines of the impressionistic version of the filters. And if I scroll down and give this just a few seconds to draw them, you can see as I click on each one how it breaks up the background and would produce quite an interesting effect and background for our glass. But I still think it needs a little bit more impact, so let's bring up that hue and saturation again. Control U is a shortcut key. There we have a good boost. We've got a good mix there between blue and yellow, which are opposites on the colour wheel, so they always go well together. But we've got a pretty strong base down here, but that may work in our favour for some of the glassware we shoot. Here, as you can see, I'm using one of my glass images. I've cropped it rather tight, but it's 1920 by 1080. But of course I could apply filter, blur, maybe motion blur. We can look at applying a linear motion blur left to right or horizontal, and we can apply as much of that as we want, or maybe up and down if that's what we fancied. But what we could do, if we wanted to introduce a colour, there's nothing to stop us from adding the blur, selecting, say, a bright colour down here, pick up our brush. We can drop the flow rate down to about 10 or 5%. We could just brush in some colour. I mean, there's no science to this, you just do whatever you think is right. And then of course we could either blur it again, we could go to the filters, blur, we could maybe look at that radial blur. Who knows what's going to work until we press the OK button.